The Wages of Complicity, A History of the White American Mindset. Introduction, A Sunday in Livermore. Consider the scene. It is Livermore, Kentucky, on an April evening in 1911. The venue is not a shadowed wood or a desolate crossroads, but the local opera house. This is not a clandestine act. It is a ticketed event. A contemporary newspaper report notes that an admission charge was levied. Quote, "Those who purchased orchestra seats were allowed to empty their guns into the hanging figure, while those in the gallery only had one shot." Another account in the New York Times describes the proceedings as a melodrama, staged against woodland scenery arranged for the presentation of a much milder drama. The victim, a black man named Will Potter, was making his first and last appearance on any stage. This was not an anomaly. Across the American South and often beyond, such events were public festivals. Whole families attended, mothers and fathers bringing their youngest children. A 1930 editorial in the Raleigh News and Observer described it as the show of the countryside, a very popular show. It noted how men joked loudly at the sight of the bleeding body, and girls giggled as the flies fed on the blood that dripped from the Negro's nose. In Maryville, Missouri, in 1931, a crowd estimated between 2,000 and 4,000, a quarter of them women and hundreds of them children, gathered for a lynching. One woman was seen holding her little girl up so she could get a better view of the naked Negro blazing on the roof. This was not the work of a few deranged individuals in the dead of night. This was a community event, a public ritual. It raises a question that sits at the very heart of the American experiment. What must a person believe about themselves, their neighbors, their God, and the human being they have paid to see tortured to death to buy a ticket to a lynching? What is the architecture of a mindset that allows an entire society to not only tolerate, but actively participate in, celebrate, and memorialize such acts of racial terrorism? This is an investigation into the psychology of white complicity, a thread that runs from an opera house in Kentucky to the algorithms of the modern internet. Part 1. The Theater of Terror and the Psychology of the Crowd. To understand the mindset, one must first understand the stage. The lynching spectacle was not merely a method of execution, it was a carefully constructed piece of social theater. It was a ritual designed to produce a specific outcome, not just for the victim, but for every person in attendance and every black person who would later hear of it. The ritual of racial dominance. The spectacle of lynching was, in its essence, a performative act. It was staged by and for the white communities, and to participate in it as a perpetrator, a spectator, or a consumer of its grisly souvenirs was to confirm one's membership in the dominant race. The goal was explicit: to make a spectacle out of the victim and make that spectacle available for public consumption. These were acts of racial terrorism intended to intimidate the entire black population, enforce the intricate etiquette of Jim Crow, and suppress any challenge, real or imagined, to the edifice of white supremacy. The stated justifications were often flimsy pretexts. While a significant number of victims were accused of serious crimes like murder or rape, many were lynched for violating social customs or for economic competition with whites. Hundreds of African Americans were murdered for offenses such as speaking disrespectfully, refusing to step off the sidewalk, or simply showing a non-submissive attitude. The act itself was a brutal reinforcement of the social order. The ritual extended beyond death. The dismemberment of victims with body parts taken as souvenirs was a common practice. Photographs of the mutilated bodies were professionally produced and sold as postcards, becoming popular mementos. This souvenir culture served a critical psychological function. It completed the transformation of the victim from a human being into an object, a thing to be collected and displayed. It was the final act in a public drama of dehumanization. The minds of the mob, dehumanization and disengagement. Such atrocities are only possible when the perpetrator ceases to see the victim as fully human. This process, known as dehumanization, has a long and bloody history, from Nazi portrayals of Jews as vermin to colonial images of Africans as simian brutes. The language of the lynching era is rife with this thinking. The glib newspaper reports on the melodrama, the casual references to cutting up black bodies like meat, all point to a profound psychological distancing. Modern neuroscience offers a chilling window into this process. Studies have shown that when people view members of traditionally dehumanized groups, those perceived as low on both warmth and competence, the medial prefrontal cortex, a key part of the brain's social cognition network, can fail to activate. This is the part of the brain we use to think about another person's mind, their thoughts, and their feelings. Its disengagement suggests that on a neurological level, the perpetrators and spectators at a lynching may not have been perceiving their victim as a person with an internal life at all. They were observing an object that elicited not empathy, but disgust, attention, and cognitive control. This neurological disengagement is the prerequisite for a mother to lift her child to get a better view of a man being burned alive. The silence of the crowd, complicity, and the bystander effect. In a mob that could number in the thousands, individual moral responsibility evaporates. This is the core of the bystander effect, a psychological phenomenon where the presence of others diffuses the personal imperative to intervene. Each individual sees that others are not acting, interprets this inaction as a form of social consensus that the event is acceptable, and in turn remains passive. The silence of the crowd becomes a roar of approval. But this was more than just a failure to act, it was a state of collective complicity. The American psychological tendency is to search for a few bad guys, to believe that racism is an infection carried by a few bad apples. The truth is that the system itself is the vector, and all who participate in it are, to some degree, complicit. The denial of racism, the widespread white belief that black people were arrested more because they were more criminal, not because the justice system targeted them, is a form of racism in and of itself. It is this collective denial, this societal level naivety, that allows the infection to grow unchecked. It is a culture of white indifference that normalizes spectacular acts of violence, rendering them invisible, or worse, justifiable to the dominant group. Lynchings were not a breakdown of the American social order, they were a technology for its enforcement. The public, ritualistic nature of these events reveals that their purpose was not merely to kill a person, but to produce and solidify a collective white identity. To attend a lynching, to buy a postcard, to tell the story of it afterward, these were acts of citizenship in a society where whiteness was defined by its absolute power over blackness. The psychological mechanisms at play did not just neutralize empathy for the victim, they inverted it. The emotional energy of the crowd was directed toward comforting the white community's sense of a violated social order. This dynamic, what modern scholars term white fragility, involves the tendency of white people to flee from the discomfort of confronting their role in racism. A lynching can be understood as a violent collective performance of this fragility. The alleged transgression of the black victim created a discomfort in the racial hierarchy, and the ritual torture was the act that comforted the mob, violently restoring what they perceived as the natural moral equilibrium. Part 2. Building the Pedestal. The ideology of positive good and the wages of whiteness. For a crowd to gather at an opera house to watch a man be murdered, they must believe their actions are not just permissible, but righteous. This righteousness was not invented on the spot. It was built upon a sophisticated and deeply embedded ideological architecture that rationalized and sanctified white supremacy. The intellectual justification. From necessary evil to positive good. In the early days of the Republic, slavery was often defended as a necessary evil. But by the 1830s, facing a growing abolitionist movement, Southern intellectuals and politicians executed a stunning public relations pivot. Slavery was rebranded as a positive good. This new ideology aggressively argued that the institution was a benevolent, paternalistic system that had rescued Africans from savagery and placed them under the fostering care of a superior civilization. Architects of this worldview, like South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun, insisted that Black people had no ability to exercise their freedom positively and were happier and better cared for than the free laborers in the North who were exploited by a system of soulless materialism. This was not a fringe theory. It was the prevailing belief of the Southern elites, a moral and intellectual framework that declared slavery to be the highest toned, the purest, best organization of society that has ever existed. It was an ideology designed to produce a clean conscience. The emotional fuel, the psychological wages of whiteness. But intellectual arguments alone do not explain why a poor white farmer who owned no slaves and was economically harmed by the plantation system would fight and die for it. To understand that, one must turn to the work of W.E.B. Du Bois and his seminal concept of the public and psychological wage. Du Bois argued that white workers, though exploited by the capitalist class, were compensated with a non-monetary wage. This wage was status. It was the public deference they received, the access they had to segregated parks, schools, and transportation, and the legal right to vote and serve on juries. It was the simple, powerful, and intoxicating belief that no matter how poor or degraded they were better than the most accomplished Black person. This wage, Du Bois explained, depends for its value on the devaluation of Black life. The lynching spectacle, then, was a public affirmation of this wage. It was a brutal dividend paid out to the entire white community, a brutal reminder of the value of their whiteness. The domestic engineers, white women as segregation's constant gardeners. The traditional narrative of this era often casts white women as passive beneficiaries of this system, delicate Southern belles placed on a pedestal, symbols to be protected. This image is a profound falsehood. White women were not merely symbols, they were active, strategic agents in the construction and daily maintenance of white supremacy. A useful framework for understanding their role is moralized white supremacist feminism. This concept describes how white women leveraged their socially sanctioned roles as mothers, wives, and moral guardians to enforce the racial hierarchy. They were segregation's constant gardeners, cultivating and naturalizing the everyday forms of white supremacy. In schools, they led the charge to dictate patriotic curricula that erased the horrors of slavery and romanticized the Confederacy. In social welfare offices, they policed the color line, determining who was recorded as white and who was not. In their communities, they organized grassroots resistance to desegregation, invoking the threats of interracial intimacy to protect their children from the dangers of equality. Their organizing power reached its apex in the 1920s with the rise of the women of the Ku Klux Klan. Far from a small auxiliary, the WKKK was a massive, independent organization that claimed 250,000 members within months of its founding. These women, many of them veterans of the suffrage movement, used their newfound political skills not for universal liberation, but for a white Protestant nationalist agenda. They were not just sewing hoods. They were boycotting Jewish-owned businesses, lobbying to have Catholic teachers fired, and working to embed racism and intolerance into the fabric of civic life. They saw it as their duty to protect their white Protestant rights from the perceived threats of immigrants and African Americans. The combination of the positive good ideology and the psychological wage functioned like a massive multi-level marketing scheme for whiteness. The planter elite at the top of the pyramid sold an identity to the masses of poor whites. The product's benefit was not material wealth, but psychological status. To keep their base invested, the leadership had to constantly reinforce the product's value, which required the continuous public devaluation of the alternative, blackness. Lynchings and the daily enforcement of Jim Crow were the aggressive marketing campaigns and sales rallies that kept the downline motivated and loyal to the brand, even when it was directly against their own economic interests. The active role of white women reveals that the primary site for the transmission of this ideology was not the state house, but the home, the school, and the church. By controlling the narrative from childhood, they naturalized the everyday forms of white supremacy, ensuring the system was reproduced not just by law, but by what was perceived as moral common sense. This made the system far more resilient, embedding it into an individual's core identity rather than leaving it just as an external law to be obeyed. But all of this ideological architecture would be nothing without further wages and fueling and devaluation. It had to be practically enforced. That's where we turn next to what unfolded at the opera stages and in the danger zones, the scope of racism. Part 3. Part 3. The myth of Northern innocence. There is a comforting story America tells itself that racism was a uniquely Southern pathology, a regional peculiarity that the more enlightened North stood against. This story is a fiction. The architecture of white supremacy was a national project, and the North was not a passive observer, but a chief architect and a primary beneficiary. The engine room. Northern finance and the nationalization of slavery. Slavery was anything but a Southern thing. The North was the engine room that powered the slave economy. Northern banks in cities like New York were the only ones large enough to extend the massive lines of credit that Southern planters needed to buy land, seed, equipment, and people. Northern insurance companies underwrote the voyages that brought enslaved Africans to American shores. Northern shipbuilders in places like Rhode Island constructed the vessels for the slave trade. And Northern textile mills, the heart of the Industrial Revolution in America, were voracious consumers of slave-picked cotton, employing a huge portion of the Northern workforce. The entire triangular trade system, which built the wealth of New England, was predicated on the labor of enslaved people. This was not incidental involvement, it was the financial and industrial backbone of the institution. The Jim Crow North. Segregation by design. While the South enforced segregation with explicit de jure laws, the North achieved the same results through a potent combination of custom, violence, and policy. Segregation was rampant in northern cities where African Americans were excluded from concert halls, public transportation, schools, and churches. The Great Migration of more than 6 million African Americans from the South was met not with open arms, but with intense and violent white backlash. Dozens of race riots, instigated by whites, erupted in northern cities like Chicago, St. Louis, and Detroit, especially during times of economic instability. This hostility led to the deliberate creation of ghettos. Through practices like redlining, where lenders refused to issue mortgages in black neighborhoods, restrictive covenants, which legally forbade homeowners from selling to black families, and racial steering by real estate agents, black populations were systematically contained. Perhaps the most brutal manifestation of Northern racism was the phenomenon of the sundown town. These were not a Southern anomaly. Thousands of communities from Maine to California became all white on purpose, violently expelling their black populations. In states like Illinois and Indiana, it is estimated that over half of all incorporated towns were sundown towns.
many of them posting signs at their limits with warnings like, "Nigger, don't let the sun go down on you." This was not segregation. It was a widespread campaign of ethnic cleansing. The South's system of racism was based on agricultural subjugation, which required the physical proximity of the enslaved and the enslaver. The North, by contrast, developed a system based on urban containment, economic exclusion, and geographic separation. The tools of this Northern model, redlining, restrictive covenants, gerrymandering, bias policing, did not require overt signs reading "whites only." They were bureaucratic, written into policy, and embedded in the market. When the Civil Rights Act of 1964 made the South's explicit Jim Crow illegal, it was the more subtle, systemic Northern model of racism that became the national standard. The American suburb, created by federal housing policies that overwhelmingly favored whites, is the ultimate expression of this Northern blueprint. By framing racism as a uniquely Southern pathology, the North was able to profit from the system of slavery and segregation while maintaining a myth of moral superiority. This created a national culture of plausible deniability. Northerners could decry the barbarism of a Mississippi lynching while ignoring the systemic violence of their own housing policies and labor markets. This historical act of psychological distancing is the direct ancestor of the modern denial that allows many white Americans to believe racism is a problem of a few bad apples rather than the very system they inhabit.
Part 4. The Great Rebranding, from Jim Crow to Colorblind Conservatism. When the legal scaffolding of Jim Crow was dismantled in the mid-20th century, the ideology of white supremacy did not disappear. It rebranded. The language evolved, adapting to a new landscape where overt bigotry was no longer socially acceptable, but the underlying objective, the preservation of racial hierarchy, remained unchanged. The birth of symbolic racism. In the post-civil rights era, public support for old-fashioned racism, the belief in biological inferiority, the demand for legal segregation, plummeted. In its place, a new form of prejudice emerged, which social scientists labeled symbolic racism or racial resentment. This new racism was not framed in the language of hate, but in the language of cherished American values like individualism and the Protestant work ethic. Its core tenets were that racial discrimination was no longer a significant barrier to Black advancement, and that any remaining inequalities were the result of Black people's own cultural failings, lack of hard work, and excessive demands on society. This allowed racial animus to be laundered through seemingly race-neutral coded language. One could oppose policies designed to help Black Americans not by saying Black people were inferior, but by invoking stereotypes of welfare queens, demanding law and order, or being tough on crime. The weaponization of colorblindness and reverse racism. The most potent tool in this rebranding was the co-opting of the aspirational ideal of a colorblind society. Conservatives purposefully misinterpreted this goal, twisting it from a future ideal to be achieved through the remediation of inequality into a present-day reality that was being violated by policies like affirmative action. This linguistic jujitsu gave birth to the powerful and politically effective narrative of reverse racism. This narrative frames any attempt to address systemic inequality as an unjust assault on white people. In this warped logic, a policy like affirmative action, designed to counteract centuries of exclusion, becomes morally and legally equivalent to the Jim Crow segregation it was meant to fight. The modern media megaphone acts as a powerful megaphone for these rebranded narratives. Its function is to manufacture and amplify a worldview in which systemic racism does not exist, where discussions of racial inequality are divisive, and where white Americans are the true victims.
This is achieved through several key tactics. One is deflection, epitomized by the black on black crime talking point, which is deployed specifically to derail any conversation about police violence and shift the blame for racial disparities away from structural factors and onto black communities themselves. Another, more recent tactic is the creation of a moral panic around an obscure academic framework, critical race theory. Conservative strategists like Christopher Rufo have been open about their goal: to take the term critical race theory and turn it into a toxic, all-encompassing brand for any conversation about race, racism, or American history that they find objectionable. This disinformation campaign has been wildly successful, reframing a tool for analyzing systemic racism into an ideology that is, in the public mind, divisive, harmful, and racist to white people. Throughout American history, racist rhetoric has evolved across three distinct eras, each characterized by different core beliefs and ways of expressing those beliefs. During the slavery and Jim Crow era, the core belief was one of biological inferiority. The rhetoric was entirely overt, with statements like, "Blacks are an inferior race incapable of self-governance." There was no need for coded or symbolic language during this period. In the post-civil rights era, the core belief shifted to cultural and moral inferiority. While some rhetoric remained overt, such as "they are getting too demanding and violating traditional values like hard work," coded rhetoric and symbolic language began to emerge. In the modern conservative era, the core belief centers on so-called reverse racism. Overt rhetoric might claim that the Civil Rights Act was a huge mistake, while coded rhetoric has become more sophisticated with statements like critical race theory teaches kids to hate America and is racist against white children. This evolution in rhetoric has made the underlying ideology more politically effective. Overt racism created clear moral lines and mobilized opposition. Coded symbolic racism is more insidious because it provides plausible deniability. It allows individuals to hold and act on racist beliefs while maintaining a non-racist self-image. A voter can support a policy that disproportionately harms Black Americans, like a restrictive voter ID law, and tell themselves they are doing it to protect election integrity, not because of race. The goal of the modern conservative media apparatus is to induce a state of white fragility at a mass scale. The constant drumbeat of narratives about reverse racism, the war on white people implied by the CRT panic, and the portrayal of Black people as a criminal threat are all designed to make the white audience feel under siege. This perpetual state of racial anxiety triggers the defensive mechanisms of anger, fear, and argumentation, short-circuiting any possibility of constructive conversation and making the audience more receptive to authoritarian figures who promise to restore their comfort and status.
Part 5. The Modern Spectacle. Charlie Kirk and the Echoes of the Crowd. The historical threads of spectacle, ideology, and complicity converge in the present moment. The modern conservative movement, particularly its MAGA wing, is the direct inheritor of this long history, adapting its tools for a digital age, but animated by the same fundamental psychology. The Digital Opera House. Charlie Kirk's Performance of Hate. A case study of Charlie Kirk and his organization, Turning Point USA, reveals not an aggravation, but a distillation of these historical patterns. His rhetoric is a masterclass in the modern performance of white supremacy. He engages in overt dehumanization, calling George Floyd a scumbag and claiming prominent Black women lack brain processing power. He denies systemic racism, labeling the concept of white privilege a racist idea. He stokes racial fear, warning of prowling Blacks who target white people for fun, and claiming that Democrats love it when America becomes less white.
and in a stunning echo of the lost cause ideology, he has argued that the 1964 Civil Rights Act was a huge mistake and that Martin Luther King Jr. was awful. Kirk's campus rallies and massive online presence function as a modern version of the Livermore Opera House. They are performative events designed to create a powerful sense of in-group solidarity through the public humiliation and denigration of an outgroup, be it a liberal student, a professor, or a political opponent. The goal, as analysts have noted, is to generate controversy, because controversy generates visibility, and visibility builds ideological influence. The digital mob, cheering on the spectacle through clicks, shares, and comments, affirms its belonging. The new tools of suppression, from lynch rope to legislation. This rhetoric is not just talk. It is directly tied to a political project. The bedrock idea uniting much of the modern right is that white Christian men in the United States are under cultural and demographic threat and require defending. This perceived threat, amplified daily by conservative media, fuels a demand for political action. One of the primary tools is voter suppression. The myth of widespread voter fraud is the modern pretext used to justify a wave of restrictive voting laws that disproportionately disenfranchise voters of color. This is a direct parallel to the post-Reconstruction redemption era, when poll taxes, literacy tests, and violence were used to strip Black Americans of their political power. This new wave of legislation is a form of whitelash, a political response by white Americans to a perceived erosion of their power and status in the face of changing demographics. Similarly, the anti-CRT laws passed in numerous states are the legislative manifestation of the media-driven moral panic. These laws aim to legally enforce a whitewashed version of American history, preventing students from learning about the very concepts of systemic racism, complicity, and privilege discussed in this report. The impact is a chilling effect on educators, who fear being targeted and a measurable decline in public trust in schools. The enduring psychology, white fragility, and the comfort of complicity. At its core, the psychology remains the same. The angry, defensive reaction to the teaching of uncomfortable history is a textbook performance of white fragility. It is not a sign of weakness, but an active performance of invulnerability, a tactic to avoid confronting one's own complicity in a racist system. Many white Americans remain in a state of psychological naivete, preferring to believe that racism is a matter of a few bad guys rather than a system in which they are all implicated. This is the ultimate privilege of whiteness, the privilege of not having to think about one's own racial identity, to see oneself as the neutral, default standard against which others are judged. The MAGA movement has brilliantly merged the spectacle with the psychological wage. A political rally has become the new opera house, offering its followers both the ritualistic thrill of public domination and the constant affirmation of their cultural and racial status. The performance pays out the psychological wage by reinforcing the idea that they are the real Americans, whose country is being stolen by immigrants, Black activists, and woke elites. The fight over voter suppression and anti-CRT laws is not just about policy. It is a war over the legitimacy of the American story. It is a battle over whose history, whose grievances, and whose identity are considered valid. Winning this war over the narrative is essential to justifying the continued payment of the psychological wage. Conclusion: the unchanging wage. The tools have evolved. The rope has become the restrictive voting law. The souvenir postcard has become the viral podcast clip. The opera house has become the online echo chamber. But while the methods have been refined and the language has been laundered, the fundamental transaction at the heart of American racism remains brutally consistent. The psychological wages of whiteness are still being paid, and their value is still dependent on the devaluation of Black life. The mindset that allows a person to turn a blind eye to or actively participate in racial injustice is not an artifact of a distant, more barbarous past. It is a product of a carefully constructed and constantly maintained ideology, one that provides justification, emotional reward, and a sense of righteous identity to those who subscribe to it. It is a mindset that allows one to see a plea for justice as an attack, a history lesson as an indoctrination, and the expansion of rights for others as an erosion of one's own. The line from the silent bystander in Livermore, Kentucky, to the modern citizen passively consuming disinformation that dehumanizes their fellow Americans is direct and unbroken. The nature of complicity has shifted from the active participation in a physical spectacle to the often passive acceptance of a digital one. But the moral and social consequences are the same. A society that refuses to confront the architecture of its own mindset cannot hope to dismantle the house that racism built. It remains the central, unfinished business of the American project.